The faith matrix, submission or inner stillness. The faith matrix is a way that we examine the way faith or spirituality works in our life. It involves 8 paths or doorways. These 8 paths or points represent 8 doorways to God. Each one is a way to strengthen our relationship to our ultimate concern, which for a Christian is God. Now these doors swing both ways. Not only are they paths to God, but they are also windows to shine God's light and God's grace outward to the world. In this video, we're beginning to talk about habits. There are 2 kinds of habits in our life that we need to keep in balance: inner habits and outer habits. The inner habits involve submission and
all behavior starts with choice. When the alarm goes off in the morning, we have a choice whether to get up. When the clock says it's time to eat, we have a choice to choose to eat. Each individual chooses things every moment of every day. Fortunately, God has put inside of us a mechanism that helps us not to be fraught with choices all the time. That mechanism is called habits. Habits are what we do automatically when we brush our teeth, when we comb our hair, when we get up at a certain time or go to bed at a certain time. We don't think about it because habits are telling us what to do. We can listen to a discussion while driving the car without thinking about driving so much because we've developed it into a habit. Habits can be good or bad or neutral. Sometimes we have bad habits, such as biting our nails or eating too much or drug habits. These hurt us. On the other hand, there's good habits. Bible study, prayer, exercise are all habits. Once we've got a habit inside of us, they run on autopilot, and we feel bad if we don't do the habits. So a large part of the faith matrix is the development of habits. And the 2 kinds of habits we have are inner habits and outer habits.
submission involves a rejection of other interests and concerns, and an unquestioning acceptance of the will of God, our ultimate concern. Now let's talk about what submission does for us. Submission provides us with a strong basis for life. Our soul cannot rest when we build on shifting sand. We have to have something solid to believe. Submission opens us up to hear God, especially to say, "Be still and know that I am God." Submission liberates us from our own tyrannical self-will. Richard Foster writes, "Every discipline has its corresponding freedom." And what freedom corresponds with submissions? It is the ability to lay down the terrible burden of always needing to get our own way. Submission is the discipline of not doing, of not speaking, of not acting, of not questioning, but waiting for directions and answers from God. Blaise Pascal wrote, "I have discovered that all the unhappiness of men arises from one single fact, that they are unable to stay quiet in their own room." Let's talk about the virtues that we can develop to help us in submission. The first of those virtues is humility, then obedience, and stability. The first virtue is humility. The scripture says that he who humbles himself will be exalted. If we want to be exalted, we need to learn to be humble. Humility is not thinking of ourselves comparatively with others, but to see ourselves as under God's protection. A humble person does not think of himself often, but focuses on the needs and the well-beings of others. A humble person does not claim to have all the answers, but is willing to admit from the first that he or she may be wrong. The virtue of obedience. It is impossible to learn obedience to God without also practicing obedience to others. Disobedience for its own sake is a kind of bondage, but authority need not be right for us to submit to it. The third virtue is stability. This is the virtue of learning to stay in one place for a long time. Eugene Peterson calls it a long obedience in the same direction. Another way of talking about it is the old adage, bloom where you are planted. Stability means to live in harmony with the community where you are, and don't leave until you've achieved that harmony. Submission and stillness are found in the character of Jesus in the Bible. Jesus began his ministry with a 40-day fast in the wilderness. He practiced submission to the Father by meeting with him in prayer at least twice a day and most likely more. At his very busiest time, he spent more time in submission to his Father, not less, in prayer. He often went away for long prayer vigils the night before a big decision. Jesus proclaimed that his one purpose in life was to do the will of his Father. Jesus submitted to the ultimate act of submission on the cross. And the night before, he prayed, "Father, if it be your will, let this cup pass from me. But nevertheless, not my will, but yours be done." Submission and stillness is also a way of bearing witness to the glory of Christ. When we become a non-anxious presence with people, they see the value of submission and stillness in us. When we submit to earthly authority, we play out our commitment to be like him in this world. By refusing to submit to evil earthly authority, we display our obedience to the Father and become an example to others. By submitting to God, we show others that we do not have to live by the tyranny of the crowd. Now, there are certain disciplines that help us to develop the virtues of submission. Among those are silence, solitude, the Sabbath, fasting, and daily private worship. Giving, simplicity, and blessing also. The first of these disciplines is silence. Silence is refraining from speaking and from hearing. It is an inside as well as an outside experience. It means that we silence our heart inside of us as well as stop listening to the noise around us. Meditation and centering prayer are ways of learning to still our heart to hear the voice of God. Solitude is another discipline of submission. Solitude simply means to withdraw, to be alone, as Jesus did so often in his ministry. Unlike loneliness, solitude is a choice, and it is a constructive choice. Solitude is never forever, but it always has a definite end in mind. Another spiritual discipline all of us should practice is the Sabbath. The Sabbath is a habit of not working all the time, but of resting for 24 hours at a time each week. Sabbath is a way of learning to trust God. While we are resting, we can trust that God will take care of all of our other affairs. Sabbath is learning a healthy way to live, where our daily work does not consume us. It is staying in touch with what is really important in our life. Sabbath is for recreation, not just rest. During this special day, we engage in activities that refresh our mind, body, and soul. Fasting. Fasting is an ancient practice practiced by the church since its beginning. Fasting is the habit of regularly saying no to our appetites and our supposed needs. It is a way of saying that God is more important to us than food. Fasting does not have to be total. It is choosing simply to refrain for a set period of time from any food or unnecessary indulgence. The early church had a partial or whole fast twice a week, usually on Wednesdays and Fridays. In our day, with our problem of food-related obesity and health, fasting is an excellent way to learn submission and to renew our body and our soul. Daily private worship. Daily private worship is the habit of setting God first in our lives by greeting him daily, usually in the morning. It is a time of worship that should be free from all distractions, in a time wholly dedicated to attention to God. This time of worship should be long enough to allow us to completely concentrate on him. Usually that takes a minimum of 10 to 15 minutes a day. This time may be spent meditating, reading scripture, praying, praising, or even journaling. Many Christians set aside more than one period of worship each day on a regular basis. This is called the daily office or the daily routine. There are other habits as well that encourage submission. For example, tithing or giving. It is a habit of giving away a tenth of what we own for God's work. There's simplicity, the habit of not hoarding things we don't need or filling our time with wasted busyness. And then there's blessings, the habit of beginning work or meals, trips, and other activities with a simple thanks to God. As with all things, there needs to be limits of submission, however, because sometimes we need to walk away from our private place and go to someplace else. And one of the reasons that we need to be careful with the disciplines of submission is because of the dangers of developing legalism. Legalism is the worship of habits and actions instead of God. It's where we begin to think that simply because we fulfilled a set of actions, that's all that really is necessary. And that can become a bondage on our heart. There's also the danger of laziness. If we start to confuse passivity with the active pursuit of God, we can get confused. We have to remember that in the Ten Commandments, when the Sabbath is called for, it also says 6 days you shall labor. We need to leave our solitude and our submission sometimes and start to get active with God.
Is a famous painting. It is called The Temptation of St. Anthony by Jan Bruegel. The artist depicts St. Anthony, who was one of the first desert monks, as going out into the wilderness, and as he did it to get away from the worldliness and the temptations of the world. But when he got out into the wilderness, he discovered that all the temptations from within followed him there. And he had the hardest temptations of his life as he tried to escape from them in the wilderness. Jesus went out into the desert, into the wilderness for 40 days. And it was at that moment that the devil tempted him more than at any other time in his life. If you begin to practice stillness, if you begin to look inside of you, you're going to find that the temptations that you face are much greater, not less, but more as you do so. Don't try to go it alone in your spiritual life. And don't spend all of your time in isolation. You need to get out. You need to have fun. You need to take breaks from that. Keep a balance between your inner life and your outer life.